Hello and welcome to Troubleshooting Zen Study and Practice number 21. This month's question, do we really need a master to follow the path, or can we do it alone? And presumably the master referred to here is a Zen master. And if we've done any reading, obviously, in the Zen line, and we know a few of the stories, we will know that this is referring to the relationship that we usually find between a Zen master and a Zen student. That Zen student may be a monk, maybe a lay person. But this relationship is found and is certainly very important and really central to a lot of the stories and teachings that we hear about in the Zen school. But I think before we sort of look into that question as to why that relationship exists and what its purpose is, maybe we could zoom out a little bit and see it within a slightly wider context, because when it comes to it, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we've come to the Buddha's teachings in the first place? Why is it that we are here? For some people, obviously, for a lot of people who are born in Buddhist countries or raised in families that are Buddhist, then it will be simply that that's what is around us. And it simply forms part of the furniture, so to speak, and part of the atmosphere within which some people are raised. And it might be that for some people, Buddhism is just something that they would say that they are if anyone asked them. Maybe they would go to the temple and make offerings. Perhaps they would go and speak to a monk if they needed some advice on something, a little bit like people might go to a vicar or a priest for some kind of pastoral care. It could be that they may pray to the Buddha if they have a problem that they feel that the Buddha can help them with, or to one of the bodhisattvas as well. If they wanted to pass an exam and so forth, that's something that's also done. And for a lot of people, that can be enough. That's their relationship to their religious faith, and that guides them and brings them through the whole of their lives. And then for some people, they may have a specific problem that they feel that the Buddha Dharma can help them with, or somebody at the temple can help them with. And I remember my own late teacher, when she was training in Japan in the 1960s, she knew a couple of people who came for very specific reasons. She cited one who was a school teacher in Japan who found it quite difficult to keep order in the class, and so he came along to the temple to sort of inculcate in himself some of that discipline that he felt was lacking in the classroom, or that he felt he was lacking in the classroom. And over time, he became the jikijitsu. That is the timekeeper and the person who is leading the periods of zazen. And the jikijitsu gets to walk around the zendo during the sitting periods with what's called the keisaku. The keisaku is a long stick that's flattened at one end that sits on the altar, and it's used for correcting people, for setting posture, and also for waking people up. People can be struck by it during the sittings if their sitting is becoming slack or too sleepy. And this Keisaku is actually also called euphemistically the sword of Manjushri. Manjushri being the bodhisattva of compassion, of course, and if you're familiar with his pictures or images of Manjushri, he holds aloft in his right hand a flaming sword that is used to cut through the bonds of ignorance and hence help assist people to realize wisdom, the prajna paramita. And so the keisaku is euphemistically referred to as that. And the teacher felt that this really gave him that solidity that he was looking for. And when he was back in the classroom, all he had to do was to step into that, because he had, so to speak, rediscovered it or fashioned it walking around the zendo, holding the keisaku. It's done very formally, and that holding together has a power to it, and the children could see that power. And if it's accompanied by maybe the odd shout that has that real strength in it, then it sort of shakes us when that if a shout or something like that really has that power in it, that full feeling in it, it shakes us to the core, and it helps pull us together. And he found that that worked for him, and he was able then to fulfill his capability and duty as a teacher. And he had found that sort of missing piece, so to speak. So it was a very specific problem that he had. He went to the temple, and he found that doing some training there helped him in a very practical, everyday, everyday way with his job. And there was no, that was it. It went no further than that. She said there was another example of a student an American student who was over in Japan, and this was in the early to mid 60s, when the whole space race was very much underway. And when he went back to the US, he wanted to help supplement his income as a student. He wanted to take part in scientific studies and training studies for astronauts, and he wanted to sign. In particular, there was one experiment that he wanted to try, where three students would have to live together in a very confined space for a week to see how that would affect the group psychologically. This is because that's what the astronauts had to do when they went to the moon. He was rather nervous about this, because he wasn't sure he'd be able to live in a confined space for a week, and that other people would really, get on his nerves, and he wouldn't be able to handle it. So he came to the temple and he practiced zazen, and the zazen, has something of that. One feels constrained in the zendo. One cannot just disport oneself all over the place. And he found that worked, and he went back. And funnily enough, he actually, after his training and after his degree, as a postgrad degree, he went into, and he switched disciplines into Buddhist studies, and continued along that line. So in that case, it did have a deeper effect. But that wasn't the main reason that he was going. He wasn't that interested in Buddhism at the time. He also had this very specific problem that he wanted to solve. So people come to the Buddha Dharma for very specific reasons. And the Buddha himself, if we go all the way back to the time of the Buddha, the Buddha didn't teach Buddhism in one way. That in a way that came later. People came up with problems. They had a problem, or they were searching for a particular answer, and the Buddha, assisted them with that. So, suffering I teach, and the way out of suffering. We've mentioned before that this is the core of the Buddha's teachings. But, what is it that I'm suffering from specifically? Suffering is a general term. So right now, or yesterday or tomorrow, what is it that I'm suffering from? And this is the issue that we're actually facing. And if the Buddha Dharma can help us in a way, sometimes people find bowing useful, others find some zazen useful, others just need to go and have a talk to be reminded perhaps a little bit, which helps put a problem into context and give some useful perspective on it. It could be all sorts of things. It could just be coming to stay in a temple. I've known people who've, come to the end of it. Perhaps they've suffered some kind of loss, maybe a redundancy or a breakdown in a relationship, something like that. And, we'll go to a temple maybe for a month, and it just helps, shake everything down and put everything back into place, and give a sort of inkling as to where to from here. And so in many ways, if we're just going in for something like that, we don't really need a master. We have a place, there'll be a priest there or a monk or a nun, but we're not looking for anything deeper than that. And this, the Buddha recognized. I mean, this is a valid path. It's the path of the lay person. and the Buddha called it Kusalamula, which means putting down wholesome roots, and it's an absolutely valid path in Buddhism. It consists of good conduct, obviously supporting the Sangha, and in return the Sangha support us as well. And through this, through these acts of generosity, through the holding to good conduct, which obviously involve the precepts, the 5 lay precepts, and all the things that surround those, then we go forward on that, and people live very happy, contented lives in that particular way. However, there's a group of people for whom that is not enough. Something usually occurs, well, something can occur that just draws them in a little bit deeper. They want to go deeper into it. Perhaps just to give an example, I mean, the Buddha himself, obviously, when he took those 4 fateful trips out of the palace, which gave him a real problem, and then he embarked upon the spiritual path, and that's reflected all the way through the stories of the Zen masters. Perhaps one of the most famous ones is Master Hakuin, the great 18th century Japanese Zen master, also known as one of the great reformers of Zen. As a young boy, his mother was belonged to the Nichiren sect of Buddhism in Japan, and their particular local Nichiren priest was obviously something of a firebrand and liked to wax lyrical on the horrors of the 8 hot hells and the 8 cold hells in Buddhism. And the mother took young Hakuin along to that to hear this rather firebrand sermon. And then coming home in the evening, he was placed into a bath, and the traditional Japanese bath has a fire underneath it to heat the water underneath, and he saw the wood crackling, and could hear the wood crackling and see the flames, and that really came together, all gelled together with that sermon that he'd heard, and he became absolutely terrified of fire. Really became quite traumatic, and then he was told that if he practiced zazen and did some recitation of the scriptures and so forth, that would help him. And so he began earnestly doing this as a boy, and then every month he would try and pick up a hot coal, and it would burn him, and so on. So his problem didn't go away, and it was quite a long and convoluted path, but that was what really spurred him on. And then in his 20s, he had a very profound insight. And in fact, he got quite carried away with it. So profound, he thought that no one else had had anything like it for at least 200 years. But the problem was that none of the existing Zen masters would acknowledge his insight, and he was determined that someone would. And then finally, he had to go to the Shonen Ronin, who was a very fierce master, who recognized Hakuin as a potentially very good student, but that he'd fallen into this obsession, and he needed to be got out of it, and so treated him very roughly for a year or so, until finally he had his own, Hakuin that is, had his own breakthrough. So here we see a whole story, and it becomes quite clear as well that there's no way that Hakuin could have got to where he did get to without the help of a master. So this is why Buddhism has that as well, and very clearly Buddhism has always been taught face to face. I mean, even with the lay people, people go to the temple and they will hear the monks or the ordained preach. That's how it's done in all the Buddhist countries, not just in Japan. That's how it's always been done, and so people have always had deference to that. Hence why the robe is venerated very much in Buddhist countries. But if we want to go that little bit deeper, then we need someone who's outside of ourselves, who can look in, so to speak, because being inside ourselves and carrying ourselves around with us, we cannot see ourselves as others see us, and therefore there are plenty of things that we do not see about ourselves. And that we need other people to point out. And of course, it goes deeper than that as well, because this very I itself, the Buddha declared, was a delusion. So if our seeing, if our hearing, if our touching, tasting, smelling, and our cognizing is afflicted by delusion, then it goes without saying that I cannot really rescue myself, because how will I know? It's one of those interesting things. People who've been involved in spiritual training for a long time, and I've come across obviously quite a few, but I've also come across a sort of subset of people who never really want to settle down with one teacher. They become quite convinced that they can do it all themselves, and they will say, well, I know what's wrong with myself, and they'll rattle off a whole long list of stuff. But it's sort of interesting because quite often there'll be something that they don't see. In fact, always there'll be something that they don't see. That's the whole point. That's why a problem is a problem. If we can see into a problem, then it's no longer a problem, really. We can become free of it. But the fact that something is a problem means that we don't know its cause and we don't know its ending either. That's why it's a problem. And that not knowing, that is the ignorance of the delusion. And that ignorance can have several reasons for it. It could just genuinely not be we lack knowledge, but more often than not, we just lack the capacity to see something that actually is there in plain sight. This is the whole point of that wonderful parable by the Buddha, the parable of the rope, of the man this is India at the time of the Buddha, going home in the twilight, and as he's walking along down the road, he sees what he thinks is a snake crossing the path. Now, snakes are very real, and are very dangerous as well, particularly a cobra. And so he starts and jumps back. But the Buddha is standing there and says to him, "Look again." And he looks again, and he realizes that what he thought was a snake in the twilight actually is just a piece of old rope lying across the road. And with a sense of real relief, he goes to step over it. And then the Buddha says again, "Pick it up." So he picks it up, and as he brings it towards his eyes, it's a string of jewels. Of course, it was always a string of jewels, but because of his poor seeing, he wasn't able to see it so. Maybe he'd heard someone talking earlier saying, "Oh, I've taken that path that you take home, and I saw a cobra along there a couple of weeks ago." We forget those things, but they sit in the back of our minds, and then can come out and haunt us. If we're feeling a little bit frightened, then we think fearful thoughts, and that might be one of them that sort of springs up. And when we see an ambiguous shape, then our imagination colours in the rest, so to speak. And then obviously he sees the rope. Well, you would sort of expect, if it wasn't going to be a snake, it might just be something innocuous like an old piece of rope. The last thing you would be expecting is a string of gems to be lying in the middle of the road. So those expectations that he had are fueled by his emotionally toned thoughts, produces his experience, first of the snake, then of the rope, and then finally, cleared of those two delusions or obstructions, he sees, in fact, the gems, which is what had been there all the time. So it's a good parable because it shows that, in fact, we do need a Buddha to stand there and say, "Look again, pick it up." And of course, we have to trust the Buddha. The other thing is that if we don't trust the Buddha, if we don't trust the teacher, then of course we can't really learn anything from them either. So faith in the teacher is really important. And I suspect that maybe that might be part of the reason for this question being asked. It quite often is that people are rather wary about giving their trust to somebody, because it does require great trust. There's no doubt about it. Both ways. in fact, both from the student to the master and from the master to the student as well. So obviously the student has to trust the master to be genuinely leading them along the Buddha's path, that it's a genuine lineage, and that the master is motivated by compassion and so forth. And the master, in turn, also has to put great faith in the student as well, that the student's own heart is genuine, and that the motivation is strong enough because after all, the master has to invest a lot of time into his or her students, and if somebody isn't really up to it, or is not really well motivated, or doesn't have genuine motivations, then a lot of time can be wasted, and also don't forget that master is also going to be putting that student into to be in charge of others in time as well. So will be responsible for the outcome of his own students. So that trust cuts both ways, and that's why it's such an important bond. So why do we need a master? Well, we need a master because we cannot see ourselves completely, and someone who's been through the training can, or at least is in a better position to be able to. And to be fair, people do move from one teacher to another as well. That's Zen certainly has a history of that. This is why the monks, after a period of training, once the master is satisfied, will send the monk out to go and see others, and to see if that training can hold up, because maybe the second master will see something the first one didn't, and in that way then the student gets an all-round training, so to speak. But just looking at the last part, so do we really need a master to follow the path, or can we do it alone? I think that can we do it alone is also important as well, because that also does exist. In Buddhism as well. And if we remember, the Buddha himself, he went out into the forest alone after he had been with two very great meditation teachers, and there he sort of settled himself down. Now he did it because there's nothing else available at the time. But I think this does show something that's very important, and that just as some people can have difficulty, giving that trust to a master, some people can go the other way, to the other extreme, and become too dependent, so to speak. And we have to remember that the Buddhist teachings and the Zen school as well, which is a Buddhist school, of course, has that requirement that the student is responsible for his or her own training, and this is why in the sutras, for example, or even in the Zen scriptures, it's always the student who comes up and asks the master a question. The masters tend not to, well, they do give teishos, but they tend to not say anything unless someone actually asks them a question. And in that way, we're not just spoon-fed. We are responsible. We have to make the effort to ask the question, to come up with something that's genuine and that matters to us. And if it does, then we become then the training is beginning to make an impact into us. So being over reliant on the teacher can also be a mistake, expecting to be spoon fed all the time. And a good teacher will recognize this and will shake his students up from time to time. There's that story of Master Basso, for example, who came to his own insight through the phrase "heart is Buddha." And that's in turn what he used to use with his students. The heart is Buddha. Heart is Buddha. And in fact, he used it so often it became synonymous with him. So, if somebody mentioned Master Basso, oh, he's the one who teaches heart is Buddha. Heart is Buddha, oh, that's Master Basso. So, it becomes familiar, and it becomes so familiar, it becomes over familiar, and no one really ponders what the phrase means. It just becomes, it becomes like an avatar, I suppose. It just becomes connected with him, and with Basso, and no one really ponders it very deeply. And Basso recognised this, so one day, taking the high chair for the sermon, opens his mouth, and everybody expects to hear heart is Buddha, and instead he says neither heart nor Buddha. And everybody goes, what? Neither heart nor Buddha. But you teach heart is Buddha. Neither heart nor Buddha. And that now is the teaching. And this is done deliberately to shake everybody up and throw them out of that over familiarity that can sometimes occur. And this is because in the end, all the attachments have to be dropped, so that the student doesn't depend on anything at all, actually, and is quite open, because the Buddha nature being inherent, we don't need to go outside to get everything. This is why Master Mumon says the treasures of the house do not come in through the front gate. And it's also a reference to what Master Rinzai called the independent man of the way, which was Rinzai's own way of putting that. So, some interesting question. That is an interesting question, and a question that often comes up. And for each of us, there will be certain facets to it. Some intellectual, some emotional, as well, which all have to be investigated. And actually, when working with a teacher, or when with a teacher, they do come up, indeed. Because it's not just it's not just trust as well. It's also a case of affinity links, what's known as affinity links as well, a sort of chemistry that can exist between the student and the master. If it's there, then something really positive will come out of it. But if it's not there, then you can have a great teacher and you can have a very great potential student as well. But if that chemistry is not there, then it won't work. So it's a very delicate thing in some ways, but it's a very powerful bond as well. And thinking in particular, if you want to read something about that relationship, Soko Morinaga Roshi's Pointers to Insight, where he talks about Master Zwegan and this quite tumultuous relationship that could be, but yet a profound bond between the two of them. As well. Anyway, that could certainly give an insight onto this question. Okay, we'll leave it there for now.